All right, we are going to get into the actual book now of Awful Disclosures, A Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed by Maria Monk. And we're in chapter 1. Early Recollections. Early life, religious education neglected, first schools, interest into the nun, not interest, but entrance into the school of the Congregational Nunnery. Brief account of the nunneries in Montreal, the Congregational Nunnery, the Black Nunnery, the Grey Nunnery. Public respect for these institutions. Instruction received, the Catechism, the Bible. My parents were both from Scotland, but had been resident in Lower Canada some time before their marriage, which took place in Montreal, and in that city I spent most of my life. I was born at St. John's, where they lived for a short time. My father was an officer under the British government, and my mother has enjoyed a pension on that account ever since his death. Footnote, see the affidavit of William Miller in the appendix. According to my earliest recollection, he was attentive to his family, and a particular passage from the Bible which often occurred to my mind in afterlife I may very probably have been taught by him, as after his death I do not recollect to have received any religious instruction at home, and was not even brought up to read the scriptures. My mother, although nominally a Protestant, not being accustomed to pay attention to her children in this respect, she was rather inclined to think well of the Catholics, and often attended their church. To my want of religious instruction at home and the ignorance of my Creator and my duty, which was its natural effect, I think I can trace my introduction to convents and the scenes which I had to describe in this narrative. When about 6 or 7 years of age, I went to school to a Mr. Workman, a Protestant, who taught in Sacrament Street and remained several months. There I learned to read and write and arithmetic as far as division. All the progress I ever made in those branches was gained in that school, as I have never improved in any of them since. A number of girls of my acquaintance went to school to the nuns of the Congregational Nunnery, or Sisters of Charity, as they are sometimes called. The schools taught by them are perhaps more numerous than some of my readers may imagine. Nuns are sent out from that convent to many of the towns and villages of Canada to teach small schools, and some of them are established as instructresses in different parts of the United States. When I was about 10 years old, my mother asked me one day if I should not like to learn to read and write French, and I then began to think seriously of attending the school in the Congregational Nunnery. I had already some acquaintance with that language, sufficient to speak it a little, as I heard it every day, and my mother knew something of it. I have a distinct recollection of my first entrance into the nunnery, and the day was an important one in my life, as on it commenced my acquaintance with a convent. I was conducted by some of my young friends along Notre Dame Street till we reached the gate. Entering that, we walked some distance along the side of a building towards the chapel until we reached a door, stopped, and rung a bell. This was soon opened, and entering, we proceeded through a long covered passage till we took a short turn to the left, soon after which we reached the door of the schoolroom. On my entrance, the superior met me and told me, first of all, that I must always dip my fingers into the holy water at her door, cross myself, and say a short prayer. And this, she told me, was always required of Protestants as well as Catholic children. There were about 50 girls in the school, and the nuns professed to teach something of reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography. The methods, however, were very imperfect, and little attention was devoted to them, the time being in a great degree engrossed with lessons and needlework, which was performed with much skill. The nuns had no very regular parts assigned them in the management of the schools. They were rather rough and unpolished in their manners, often exclaiming, "That's a lie," and "My God," on the most trivial occasions. Their writing was quite poor, and it was not uncommon for them to put a capital letter in the middle of a word. The only book on geography which we studied was a Catechism of Geography, from which we learnt by heart a few questions and answers. We were sometimes referred to a map, but it was only to point out Montreal or Quebec or some other prominent name while we had no instruction beyond. It may be necessary for the information of some of my readers to mention that there were 3 distinct convents in Montreal, all of different kinds, that is, founded on different plans and governed by different rules. Their names are as follows. First, the Congregational Nunnery. Second, the Black Nunnery, or Convent of Sister Burgess, Bourgeoise. Not exactly sure how to say that. 3, the Grey Nunnery. The first of these professes to be devoted entirely to the education of girls. It would require, however, only a proper examination to prove that, with the exception of needlework, hardly anything is taught excepting prayers and the catechism. The instruction of reading, writing, etc., in fact, amounting to very little and often to nothing. This convent is adjacent to that next to be spoken of, being separated from it only by a wall. The second professes to be a charitable institution for the cure of the sick and the supply of bread and medicines for the poor, and something is done in these departments of charity, although but an insignificant amount compared with the size of the buildings and the number of the inmates. The Grey Nunnery, which is situated in a distant part of the city, is also a large edifice containing departments for the cure of insane persons and foundlings. With this, however, I have less personal acquaintance than with either of the others. I have often seen 2 of the Grey Nuns and know that their rules, as well as those of the Congregational Nunnery, do not confine them always within their walls, like those of the Black Nunnery. These 2 convents have their common names, Black and Grey, from the colors of the dresses worn by their inmates. In all these 3 convents, there are certain apartments into which strangers can gain admittance, but others from which they are always excluded. In all, large quantities of various ornaments are made by the nuns, which are exposed for sale in the ornament room, and afford large pecuniary receipts every year, which contribute much to their incomes. In these rooms, visitors often purchase such things as please them from some of the old, and it says footnote, the term old nun does not always indicate superior age, and confidential nuns who have the charge of them. From all that appears to the public eye, the nuns of these convents are devoted to the charitable objects appropriate to each, the labor of making different articles known to be manufactured by them, and the religious observances which occupy a large portion of their time. They are regarded with much respect by the people at large, and now and then, when a novice takes the veil, she is supposed to retire from the temptations and troubles of this world into a state of holy seclusion, where by prayer, self-mortification, and good deeds she prepares herself for heaven. Sometimes the superior of a convent obtains the character of working miracles, and when such a one dies, it is published through the country, and crowds throng the convent, who think indulgences are to be derived from bits of her clothes or other things she has possessed. And many have sent articles to be touched to her bed or chair, in which a degree of virtue is thought to remain. I used to participate in such ideas and feelings, and began by degrees to look upon a nun as the happiest of women, and a convent as the most peaceful, holy, and delightful place of abode. It is true, some pains were taken to impress such views upon me. Some of the priests of the seminary often visited the Congregation Nunnery, and both catechized and talked with us on religion. The superior of the I'm so sorry, guys. I need to learn to shut that off. Let's see. It is true some pains were taken to impress such views upon me. Some of the priests of the seminary often visited the Congregation Nunnery, and both catechized and talked with us on religion. The superior of the Black Nunnery adjoining also occasionally came into the school and enlarged on the advantages we enjoyed in having such teachers, and dropped something now and then relating to her own convent, calculated to make us entertain the highest ideas of it, and to make us sometimes think of the possibility of getting into it. Among the instructions given us by the priest, some of the most pointed were those directed against the Protestant Bible. They often enlarged upon the evil tendency of that book and told us that but for it many a soul now condemned to hell and suffering eternal punishment might have been in happiness. They could not say anything in its favor, for they would be speaking against religion and against God. They warned us against it and represented it as a thing very dangerous to our souls. In confirmation of this, they would repeat some of the answers taught us at catechism, a few of which I will give here. We had little catechisms, les petites catechism, put into our hands to study, but the priest soon began to teach us a new set of answers which were not found in our books, and from some of which I received new ideas and got, as I thought, important light on religious subjects, which confirmed me more and more in my belief in the Roman Catholic doctrines. These questions and answers I can still recall with tolerable accuracy, and some of them I will add here. I never have read them as we were taught them only by word of mouth. Question: why did God make all the commandments? Answer: because man is not strong enough to keep them. What? Why did not God make all the commandments? It kind of doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. Let me read it again. Why did not God make all the commandments? Answer: because man is not strong enough to keep them. Question: why are men not to read the New Testament? Answer: because the mind of man is too limited and weak to understand what God has written. These questions and answers are not to be found in the common catechism in use in Montreal and other places where I have been, but all the children in the Congregational Nunnery were taught them, and many were not found in these books. Wow. Chapter 2, Congregational Nunnery. Story told by a fellow pupil against the priest. Other stories: Pretty Mary, confessed to Father Richards. My subsequent confessions. Left Congregational Nunnery. There was a girl 13 years old whom I knew in the school, who resided in the neighborhood of my mother and with whom I had been familiar. She told me one day at school of the conduct of a priest with her at confession, at which I was astonished. It was of so criminal and shameful a nature, I could hardly believe it, and yet I had so much confidence that she spoke the truth that I could not discredit it. She was partly persuaded by the priest to believe that he could not sin because he was a priest, and that anything he did to her would sanctify her, and yet she deemed doubtful how she should act. A priest, she had been told by him, is a holy man and appointed to a holy office, and therefore what would be wicked in other men could not be so in him. She told me that she had informed her mother of it, who expressed no anger nor disapprobation, but only enjoined it upon her not to speak of it, and remarked to her that as priests were not like other men, but holy, and sent to instruct and save us, whatever they did was right. Wow. Indeed, it was not long before such language was used to me, and I well remember how my views of right and wrong were shaken by it. Another girl at the school from a place above Montreal called the Lac told me the following story of what had occurred recently in that vicinity. A young squaw called La Belle Marie, Pretty Marie, had been seen going into confession at the house of the priest, who lived a little out of the village. La Belle Marie was afterwards missed, and her murdered body was found in the river. A knife was also found covered with blood, bearing the priest's name. Great indignation was excited among the Indians, and the priest immediately absconded and was never heard from again. A note was found on his table addressed to him, telling him to fly if he was guilty. It was supposed that the priest was fearful that his conduct might be betrayed by this young female, and he undertook to clear himself by killing her. These stories struck me with surprise at first, but I gradually began to feel differently, even supposing them true, and to look upon the priests as men incapable of sin. Besides, when I first went to confession, which I did to Father Richards in the old French church, since taken down, I heard nothing improper, and it was not until I had been several times that the priests became more and more bold, and were at length indecent in their questions, and even in their conduct, when I confessed to them in the sacristy. Sacristy? Sacristy? This subject, I believe, is not understood nor suspected among Protestants, and it is not my intention to speak of it very particularly, because it is impossible to do so without saying things both shameful and demoralizing. I will only say here that when quite a child, I had from the mouths of the priest at confession what I cannot repeat, with treatment corresponding, and several females in Canada have recently assured me that they have repeatedly and indeed regularly been required to answer the same and other like questions, many of which present to the mind deeds which the most inquisitive and corrupt heart could hardly invent. There was a frequent change of teachers in the school of nunnery, and no regular system was pursued in our instruction. There were many nuns who came and went while I was there, being frequently called in and out without any perceptible reason. They supply school teachers to many of the country towns, usually two for each of the towns with which I was acquainted, besides sending sisters of charity to different parts of the United States. Among those whom I saw most was Saint Patrick, an old woman, for a nun, that is, about 40, very ignorant and gross in her manners, with quite a beard on her face, and very cross and disagreeable. She was sometimes our teacher in sewing, and was appointed to keep order among us. We were allowed to enter only a few of the rooms in the Congregational Nunnery, although it was not considered one of the secluded convents. In the Black Nunnery, which is very near the Congregational, is an hospital for sick people from the city, and sometimes some of our boarders, such as are indisposed, were sent there to be cured. I was once taken ill myself and sent there, where I remained a few days. There were beds enough for a considerable number more. A physician attended it daily, and there are a number of the veiled nuns of that convent who spent most of their time there. These would also sometimes read lectures and repeat prayers to us. After I had been in the Congregational Nunnery about 2 years, I left. Footnote, see the second affidavit, and attended several different schools for a short time. But I soon became dissatisfied, having many and severe trials to endure at home, which my feelings will not allow me to describe. And as my Catholic acquaintances had often spoken to me in favor of their faith, I was inclined to believe it true, although, as I said before, I knew little of any religion. While out of the nunnery, I saw nothing of religion. If I had, I believe I should never have thought of becoming a nun. Chapter 3, Black Nunnery. At length, I determined to become a black nun, and called upon one of the oldest priests in the seminary, to whom I made known my intention. The old priest to whom I applied was Father Roku. Let's say Roku. He is still alive. He was at that time the oldest priest in the seminary, and carried the bon Dieu, good God, as the sacramental wafer is called. When going to administer it in any country place, he used to ride with a man before him, who rang a bell as a signal. When the Canadians heard it, whose habitations he passed, they would come and prostrate themselves to the earth, worshipping it as God. He was a man of great age, and wore large curls, so that he somewhat resembled his predecessor, Father Rowe. He was at that time as at the head of the seminary. This institution is a large edifice situated near the Congregational and Black Nunneries, being on the east side of Notre Dame Street. It is the general rendezvous and center of all the priests in the district of Montreal, and I have been told supplies all the country with priests as far down as the Three Rivers, which place, I believe, is under the charge of the Seminary of Quebec. About 150 priests are connected with that of Montreal, as every small place has one priest, and a number of larger ones have two. Father Roku promised to converse with the superior of the convent and proposed my calling again at the end of 2 weeks, at which I visited the seminary again and was introduced by him to the superior of the Black Nunnery. She told me she must make some inquiries before she could give me a decided answer, and proposed to me to take up my abode a few days at the house of a French family in St. Lawrence suburbs, a distant part of the city, where I remained about a fortnight, during which time I formed some acquaintance with the family, particularly with the mistress of the house, who was a devoted Papist and had a high respect for the superior, with whom she stood on good terms. At length, on Saturday morning, about 10 o'clock, I called and was admitted into the Black Nunnery as a novice, much to my satisfaction, for I had a high idea of a life in a convent, secluded, as I supposed the inmates to be, from the world and all its evil influences, and assured of everlasting happiness in heaven. The superior received me and conducted me into a large room where the novices, who are called in French postulants, were assembled and engaged in their customary occupation of sewing. Here were about 40 of them, and they were collected in groups in different parts of the room, chiefly near the windows, but in each group was found one of the veiled nuns of the convent, whose abode was in the interior apartments to which no novice was to be admitted. As we entered, the superior informed the assembly that a new novice had come, and she desired any present who might have known me in the world to signify it. To Miss Fulgenese and a Miss Howard from Vermont, who had been my fellow pupils in the Congregational Nunnery, immediately recognized me. I was then placed in one of the groups at a distance from them and furnished by a nun called Saint Clotilde with materials to make a kind of purse, such as the priests use to carry the consecrated wafer in when they go to administer the sacrament to the sick. I remember my feelings at that time, sitting among a number of strangers and expecting with painful anxiety the arrival of the dinner hour. Then, as I knew, ceremonies were to be performed for which I was but ill prepared, as I had not yet heard the rules by which I was to be governed, and knew which I was but ill. Oh, I said that. I'm sorry. I started to repeat myself. This was during the time of recreation, as it is called. The only recreation there allowed, however, is that of the mind, and this there is but little, and knew nothing of this except the creed in Latin, and that imperfectly. At work and permitted to speak with each other only on such subjects as related to the convent, and all in the hearing of the old nuns who sat by us. We proceeded to dinner in couples and ate in silence while a lecture was read. The novices had access to only 8 of the apartments of the convent, and whatever else we wished to know, we could only conjecture. The sleeping room was in the second story at the end of the western wing. The beds were placed in rows without curtains or anything else to obstruct the view, and in one corner was a small room partitioned off, in which was the bed of the night watch, that is, the old nun that was appointed to oversee us for the night. In each side of the partition were 2 holes through which she could look out upon us whenever she pleased. Her bed was a little raised above the level of the others. There was a lamp hung in the middle of our chamber, which showed either thing to her which showed everything to her distinctly. And as she had no light in her little room, we could never perceive whether she was awake or asleep. As we knew that the slightest deviation from the rules would expose us to her observation, as well as to that under a continual exposure to suffer. It was a virtue. Okay, it's back online. This was sent as a present to the King of England as an expression of gratitude for the money annually received from the government. It was about 40 yards in length and very handsome. We were ignorant of the amount of money thus received. The convent of Grey Nuns has also received funds from the government. I am so sorry. Though on some account or other had not for several years. I was sitting by a window at one time with a girl named Jane McCoy, when one of the old nuns came up and spoke to us in a tone of liveliness and kindness which seemed strange, and a place to cheer. I do not probably 30, her figure large, her face wrinkled, and her dress careless. She seemed also to be under less restraint than the others, and this I afterward found was the case. She sometimes set the rules at defiance. She would speak aloud when silence was required, and sometimes walk about when she ought to have kept her place. She would even say and do things on purpose to make us laugh, and although often blamed for, I don't know why my thing it keeps going in and out, guys. I'm so very sorry. I learned that this woman had always been singular. She never would consent to take a saint's name on receiving the veil, and had always been known by her, which was Jane Ray. Her irregularities were found to be numerous, and penances were of so little use in governing her that she was pitied by some who thought harshly insane. She was, therefore, calmly spoken of as Mad Jane Ray, and when she committed a fault, it was often apologized for by the superior or other nuns on the ground that she did not know what she did. The occupations of a novice in the Black Nunnery are not such as some of my readers may suppose. They are not employed in studying the higher branches of education. They are not offered any advantages of storing their mind or polishing their manners. They are not taught even reading, writing, or arithmetic, much less any of the more advanced branches of knowledge. My time was chiefly employed at first in work and prayer. It is true, during the last year I studied a great deal and was required to work but very little. But it was the study of prayers and French and Latin, which I had merely to commit to memory, to prepare for the easy repetition of them on my reception and after I should be admitted as a nun. Among the wonderful events which had happened in the convent, that of the sudden conversion of a gay young lady of the city into a nun appeared to me one of the most remarkable. The story which I first heard while a novice made a deep impression upon my mind. It was nearly as follows. The daughter of a wealthy citizen of Montreal was passing the church of Bon Secours one evening on her way to a ball, when she was suddenly thrown down upon the steps or near the door and received a severe shock. She was taken up and removed first, I think, into the church, but soon into the Black Nunnery, which she soon determined to join as a nun. Instead, however, of being required to pass through a long novitate, which usually occupies about 2 years and a half, and is abridged only where the character is particularly exemplary and devout, she was permitted to take the veil without delay, being declared by God to a priest to be in a state of sanctity. The meaning of this expression is that she was a real saint, and already in a great measure raised above the world and its influences, and incapable of sinning, possessing the power of intercession, and being a proper object to be addressed in prayer. This remarkable individual, I was further informed, was still in the convent, though I never was allowed to see her. She did not mingle with the other nuns, either at worship, or meals, for she had no need of food, and not only her soul but her body was in heaven a great part of the time. What added, if possible, to the reverence of the mysterious awe with which I thought of her was the fact I learned that she had no name. The titles used in speaking of her were the Holy Saint, Reverend Mother, or Saint Bon Pasteur, the Holy Good Shepherd. It is wonderful that we could have carried our reverence for the superior as far as we did, although it was a direct tendency of many instructions and regulations, indeed of the whole system, to permit, even to foster, a superstitious regard for her. One of us was occasionally called into her room to cut her nails or dress her hair, and we often collect the clippings and distribute them to each other. How gross is that? Nasty. Or preserve them with the utmost care. I once picked up all the stray hairs I could find after combing her head, bound them together, and kept them for some time until she told me I was not worthy to possess things so sacred. Jane McCoy and I were once sent to alter a dress for the superior. I gathered up all the bits of thread, made a little bag, and put them into it for safe preservation. This I wore a long time around my neck, so long indeed that I wore out a number of strings, which I remember I replaced with new ones. I believed it to possess the power of removing pain, and often prayed to it to cure the toothache. Jane Ray sometimes professed to outgo us all in devotion to the superior, and would pick up the feathers after making her bed. These she would distribute among us, saying, "When the superior dies, relics will begin to grow scarce, and you had better supply yourself in season." Then she would treat the whole matter in some way to turn it into ridicule. Equally contradictory would she appear, when occasionally she would obtain leave from the superior to tell her dreams. With a serious face, which sometimes imposed upon all of us and made us half believe she was in a perfect state of sanctity, she would narrate in French some unaccountable vision which she said she had enjoyed. Then turning around, would say, "There are some who do not understand me. You all ought to be informed." And then she would say something totally different in English, which put us to the greatest agony for fear of laughing. Sometimes she would say that she expected to be superior herself one of these days, and other things which I have not room to repeat. While I was in the Congregational nunnery, I had gone to the parish church whenever I was to confess, for although the nuns had a private confession room in the building, the boarders were taken in parties through the streets on different days by some of the nuns to confess in the church. But in the black nunnery, as we had a chapel and priests attending in the confessionals, we never left the building. Our confessions there as novices were always performed in one way, so that it may be sufficient to describe a single case. Those of us who were to confess at a particular time took our places on our knees near the confessional box, and after having repeated a number of prayers prescribed in our books, came up one at a time and kneeled beside a fine wooden lattice work which entirely separated the confessor from us, yet permitted us to place our faces almost to his ear, nearly concealed his countenance from view, even when so near. I recollect how the priest used to recline his head on one side and often covered their faces with their handkerchiefs while they heard me confess my sins, and put questions to me which were often of the most improper and even revolting nature, naming crimes both unthought of and inhuman. Still, strange as it may seem, I was persuaded to believe that all this was their duty, or at least that it was done without sin. Veiled nuns would often appear in the chapel at confession, though, as I understood, they generally confessed in private. Of the plan of their confession rooms, I had no information, but I suppose the ceremony to be conducted much on the same plan as in the chapel and in the church, with a lattice interposed between the confessor and the confessing. Punishments were sometimes resorted to while I was a novice, though but seldom. The first time I ever saw a gag was one day when a young novice had done something to offend the superior. This girl I always had compassion for because she was so very young and an orphan. The superior sent for a gag and expressed her regret at being compelled by the bad conduct of the child to proceed to such a punishment, after which she put it in her mouth so far as to keep it open, and then let it remain some time before she took it out. There was a leathern strap fastened to each end and buckled to the back part of the head. What wickedness. All right. I'll pick that up later. I don't even know. Just insane. But, I don't even know. Just keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. I can't urge you enough. I can't urge myself enough. As you keep your eyes on him and you keep your eyes in the book, which is reading the word of God, meditate on the word of God, ask God to reveal to you what he is saying to you through his written word. We got to get prepared, brothers and sisters. Time is now. Time is now. I love you all. Bye-bye.